I came down for breakfast, and my chair was gone. My daughter sent me to eat in my room, right in front of my grandkids. I'm Sylvia, 71 years old, former merchant down at the docks. I went upstairs for my yellow folder. Today, I'm going to charge them every single cent. The smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee flooded the downstairs hallway. Those smells were always my weakness. The reward after waking up at 5 a.m. for over 40 years to open my wholesale grain and spice shop down at the harbor. Yet, on that Tuesday morning, the aroma felt like a sick joke. The dining room, the beating heart of my house, was occupied. The massive red oak table I picked out and paid for in cash over 2 decades ago was packed tight. I stood in the doorway, resting my right hand against the wooden frame. My eyes scanned the room, looking for the obvious, my chair. The one that always sat at the head of the table by the window to catch the ocean breeze. It had vanished. In its place, the gap had been closed by the other chairs, squeezed together to fit Melissa's 5 kids. Melissa, my only daughter, had her back to me, pouring coffee into ceramic mugs. The exact same mugs I bought on a trip to New York. She poured 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cups. The glass pot went back on the burner. No mug for me, no plate, no chair. I took a step forward, letting the sole of my shoe squeak faintly against the terracotta tile. Melissa turned around, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at me with a mix of annoyance and rushed the expression that had become her permanent face over the last few months. "Mom, there's no room left," she said with a casual tone, like she was announcing we were out of bread. "The kids have gotten so big, the table's too small for us. I put your plate and your coffee on a tray. Eat it in your room. You'll be more comfortable and quiet up there." The silence that followed her words was deafening. My 5 grandkids were right there. Hunter, the 19-year-old, didn't even look up from his cell phone. His thumbs flew across the screen while he chewed loudly. The 14-year-old twins traded a quick glance and went back to burying their spoons in their bowls of oatmeal. The 2 little girls just kept coloring in a notebook at the corner of the table, completely blind to the cruelty their mother had just spit out. Nobody said a word. Nobody stood up to offer me their seat. Nobody questioned the order. I felt a sudden heat crawling up my neck, a fire that had nothing to do with the humid coastal weather. It was pure, distilled outrage. I looked at the plastic tray Melissa had left on the kitchen counter. It held a plate of scrambled eggs, a couple of pieces of toast, and a half-empty mug of coffee. It looked like a prisoner's ration, or the scraps you leave out for the night watchman down at the docks. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Years in the wholesale business taught me that whoever loses their temper in a negotiation loses the merchandise. And this wasn't just some morning disrespect. This was a hostile takeover. They were wiping me off the map in my own territory. "All right, Melissa," I said. My voice was so flat, so ice-cold, it even surprised me. I turned around and started climbing the stairs. Every wooden step creaked under my weight, a familiar sound I'd known since the day I oversaw the construction of this house. As I climbed, the ache in my left knee tried to remind me of my age, but the adrenaline of pure fury numbed any physical pain. I reached my bedroom and shut the door behind me. The room was cool, lit by the morning sun filtering through the blinds. I walked over to the window and looked out at the backyard. The mango and lemon trees I planted with my own hands, with dirt stuck under my nails after long shifts selling bulk rice and beans. I reached into my skirt pocket and pulled out my heavy brass keys. They were ancient, the kind of keys that open metal roll-up doors and heavy-duty lockboxes. The metallic clink pulled me back to the present. I sat on the edge of my bed, smoothing the quilt with the palm of my hand. I remembered the day Melissa moved back into this house. It was 10 years ago. She showed up crying, dragging cheap suitcases and 3 kids, pregnant with the twins. Her husband, a man with more promises than work ethic, had left her for another woman. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, made her a hot cup of soup, and told her this would always be her home. I worked double shifts at the market. I woke up when the sky was still pitch black. I negotiated with the longshoremen at the port, fought over the price of spices, counted crumpled bills and grease-stained coins. Also, this house would never lack meat on the table, so there would be new shoes every school year, so the medicine cabinet was always fully stocked. When I retired 5 years ago and handed over the business, I thought I'd finally rest. I thought I'd enjoy my home, my family, but exhaustion and old age have a funny effect on how people look at you. They make you invisible. Melissa started taking the reins of the house. At first, it was little things. She changed the living room drapes without asking me. Then she started deciding the weekly menu based solely on what her kids liked. Later, her get-togethers with her friends took over the patio. I allowed it. I wanted peace. I thought it was the natural cycle of life, letting the next generation take the wheel. But they confused my silence with submission and my age with weakness, thinking that just because my hair is white and I walk a little slower, I've lost my memory or my authority. That was her gravest mistake, taking my chair, sending me to my room. That symbolic act was the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was my place in the family. My dignity as the matriarch. They were telling me I was no longer part of the circle, that I was a nuisance, that I needed to be fed in the shadows so I wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of their morning. I stood up from the bed with an energy I hadn't felt since my best days at the market. I walked over to the massive mahogany wardrobe dominating one wall of the bedroom. I slid the smallest brass key into the lock of the bottom drawer. The mechanism gave a sharp, firm click. I pulled the drawer open. It smelled like old wood and mothballs. Beneath a pile of wool sweaters I rarely use because of the coastal heat, there was a false bottom. I lifted it. There rested my true legacy. My insurance policy against being forgotten and mistreated. I pulled out a yellow folder. The edges were worn, the cardboard soft from the passage of time. I sat in the armchair by the window and opened it carefully. The smell of ancient paper and dried ink filled my lungs. It was the scent of my hustle, the perfume of my independence. Inside the folder lay a stack of perfectly organized documents. My hands, marked by age spots and scars from wooden crates, turned the pages with reverence. First, the property deed. An official document with notary seals making it crystal clear, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this 2-story house, with its 4 bedrooms, its massive backyard, and its street frontage, was the sole and exclusive property of Sylvia. No early inheritances, no co-owners. The house was mine. Then, the property tax receipts. All paid on time, year after year, straight out of my savings account. The electric bills, the water bills, the high-speed internet these kids used all day for their phones and video games. Everything was in my name. Everything came out of my pocket. But what I was looking for was in the left flap of the folder. 7 original receipts, stapled together, printed on that carbon paper they hardly use anymore, but which preserves numbers like they were written yesterday. I detached the receipts and spread them out on my lap. The first invoice was from $1,998 from the furniture store downtown. The description was clear. Red oak dining room set, colonial style, 8-foot table, 8 upholstered chairs. At the bottom, the paid stamp and my signature. That dining set where they were currently eating like royalty? I bought it with the profits from an exceptional season of selling coffee beans. The second receipt was for the appliances. The double-door refrigerator where Melissa kept her food, the 6-burner stove where she cooked breakfast this morning, all paid for by me. The third, fourth, and fifth receipts were for the home renovations. The terracotta floors they walked on with such indifference, the expansion of the kids' bedrooms, the installation of the ceiling fans that kept them cool. The sixth receipt was for the orthopedic mattresses I bought them a couple of years ago because they complained about back pain. And the seventh receipt, the most recent one, was the payment in full for the installation of flat-screen TVs in every single one of their bedrooms. I stared at those papers for a long time. The printed letters seemed to leap off the page. The total amount invested in the comfort of that family was staggering. I never charged them a dime. I never asked for rent. I never demanded they pitch in for household upkeep. I did it out of love, out of a sense of duty, because a mother doesn't leave her cubs out in the cold. But love has to be mutual, and respect is non-negotiable. Melissa had forgotten who owned the house. She had convinced herself that she was the lady of the manor, and I was just some retired old woman living on her charity, someone she could hide in a bedroom so I wouldn't get in the way. She had poisoned my grandkids' minds with that exact same idea, teaching them by example that grandma was invisible, irrelevant, an old piece of furniture that could be shoved aside at will. I ran my fingertip over my signature on the first receipt. I felt an immense tranquility, that cold, calculating calm that precedes a perfect storm. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to make a scene in the kitchen or beg for a chair at my own table. This morning's humiliation was the catalyst I needed to wake up from my coma. They had treated me like a dog thrown a bone in the backyard. But the dog turned out to be the owner of the estate. I closed the yellow folder firmly. The sound of the cardboard slapping together was music to my ears. I gathered the 7 receipts and slipped them into a manila envelope. The initial sadness I felt seeing my missing chair had completely evaporated, replaced by an ironclad determination. I was going to teach them a lesson in logic and mathematics. If my daughter's logic was that there was no room for me in the dining room, my mathematical logic would prove that there was no room for them in my finances or my property under those conditions. I stood up, walked over to the bathroom mirror, and looked at myself. I saw the wrinkles around my eyes, the gray hair pulled back in a strict bun. I saw the woman who unloaded freight at dawn. The woman who made a fortune selling grain penny by penny. The woman who built a tiny but rock-solid empire in this port city. That woman was back. I grabbed my brass keys again, squeezing them in my fist until the metal dug slightly into my skin, reminding me I was alive and still in absolute control of my destiny. I walked to the bedroom door, holding the yellow folder under my arm like it was a shield and a sword all at once. I opened the door and heard the laughter drifting up from downstairs. They were having fun. They'd finished breakfast and were probably getting ready to leave, dumping their dirty dishes in the sink so the imaginary maid, meaning me, could wash them later. I stepped onto the first stair. The docile old woman who walked up here half an hour ago was dead and buried in that room. The woman descending these stairs was the landlord, ready to collect back rent on her dignity. I reached the ground floor with a steady stride. The dining room was empty of people, but full of the remains of their feast. The chairs, my chairs, were a mess, shoved back carelessly. Smeared egg yolks, mugs of cold coffee, and crumpled napkins littered the red oak table. The terracotta floor was sprinkled with breadcrumbs and spilled juice. It looked like the scene of a looting. I walked down the hall toward the backyard, passing the living room. Hunter was sprawled across the 3-seater sofa I bought 6 years ago, huge headphones over his ears, his eyes glued to his phone screen. He didn't even blink when I walked by. It was like I was transparent, a ghost haunting the halls of her own castle. I stepped out onto the patio. The humid coastal heat was already getting heavy, but I've always liked it. I sat in a wicker rocking chair in the shade of the oldest mango tree. I placed the yellow folder on my knees and took a deep breath. The invisibility of old age is a slow poison. You don't realize you're drinking it until one day you look in the mirror and notice that people no longer see a person. They just see antique furniture. Down at the market, when I walked down the wholesale aisles, the toughest men stepped aside to let me pass. "Morning, Miss Sylvia," the dock workers would say, taking off their sweat-stained caps. The suppliers knew you didn't mess with me when it came to the weight of coffee sacks or the quality of the corn. I was a presence of flesh, bone, and authority. But here, under my own roof, I had been erased. My white hair and my slower limp from my left knee had become an invisibility cloak. Melissa and her kids. They saw me as an endless, silent ATM, a machine that paid the bills and required zero maintenance. I was partly to blame. I wanted to give them the easy life I never had. I thought unconditional love was automatically repaid with respect. What a terrible businesswoman I was when it came to family. I forgot the golden rule of the docks. What you give away for free is never valued. I opened the yellow folder again and ran my hand over the documents. It was time to take inventory of my assets and evaluate my competition. My resources were absolute. The deed to the house was in my name, free and clear of any liens or mortgages. My bank account, fattened by decades of pre-dawn labor and the sale of the business, had enough funds to keep me comfortable until my dying day. My health, despite the aches of being 71, was strong. My mind was as sharp as a butcher's knife. And above all, I had the element of surprise. They thought I was a meek old lady who'd settle for eating in her room. What were Melissa's resources? My daughter worked part-time at a downtown clothing boutique, a job that barely covered her fancy skin creams and coffee dates with her friends. She didn't pay for electricity. She didn't pay for water. She didn't pay property taxes. She had no idea what it cost to fill the propane tank, or how much the price of meat jumped every month. She lived in a glass bubble, blown with my lungs. The grandkids were even more fragile. Hunter, at 19, was an expert in video games and entirely illiterate in responsibility. The twins and the little girls were a reflection of their mother, used to asking and receiving without a simple thank you. Their biggest strength was my weakness for them, my grandmotherly instinct. But that instinct had starved to death this very morning, right in front of a cup of coffee I was never served. They were morally and financially bankrupt, and they didn't even know it. They relied on my infrastructure to exist. I closed the folder and looked toward the large tool shed at the back of the patio. I kept it locked with a heavy padlock, the key dangling from my brass ring. That shed was massive, dry, and secure. A good merchant doesn't throw a tantrum when a client refuses to pay. They simply cut off the supply. If Melissa and her kids wanted to live by the logic that there was no room for me in this house, I would apply that exact same logic to them, ruthlessly. I would show them that in my house, space, furniture, and comforts are earned, not demanded. My plan mapped itself out in my head with the precision of an accounting ledger. Phase 1. Technology. The oxygen of that spoiled youth was the internet and television. I paid for the fastest, most expensive package in the city just so they wouldn't complain about their games lagging. That ends today. Phase 2. Furniture. If my red oak table was too small for my chair to fit, then the whole table was in the way. The flat-screen TVs decorating their rooms, bought with my money so they could have privacy, would return to my inventory. Phase 3. Food and service. I was done being the phantom janitor of this property. I wasn't going to yell at them. I wasn't going to throw them out on the street immediately, because that would just make them victims in the eyes of the neighbors and themselves. I wanted them to feel the harsh grip of scarcity, to experience firsthand what it means to be stripped of your safe space. I was going to suffocate them with the exact same indifference they showed me. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, a simple but highly efficient device, and scrolled through my contacts. The first number I dialed was the cable company. A bored-sounding operator answered on the third ring. I gave her my info, my account number, and my security PIN. "I need to cancel my internet and cable service immediately," I said, my voice steady. The operator tried to offer me promotions, discounts, cheaper bundles. I answered her with the same ice-cold tone I used to haggle the price of pinto beans in my prime. "I'm not interested in any promotions, ma'am. I want a total cancellation of services, today." "As you wish, Miss Sylvia." The disconnection will reflect in our system in approximately 2 hours. I hung up. That was the first line crossed out in my ledger. Then I looked for another number. Frank had been my most trusted freight loader for 20 years at the market. A massive guy, hands like backhoe buckets, and bulletproof loyalty. Now he owned his own small moving truck. He picked up on the first ring. "Miss Sylvia, what a miracle. How can I help the boss lady?" The raspy, respectful voice of Frank was a balm. Someone in this world still remembered who I was. "Frank, my boy, I need a massive favor," I said, leaning back against the wicker rocking chair. "Tomorrow, Wednesday, at 10 a.m., I need you to come to my house with your truck and a couple of guys you trust. You name it, Miss Sylvia. We moving heavy freight?" "We're moving some furniture from my own house, Frank. My own things. We're moving some stuff into the backyard tool shed, and you'll take the rest to your storage unit for a while. I need you to be fast and quiet. I'll pay double your usual rate." "There's no rate for you, boss. Tomorrow at 10, I'm there with 2 strong boys. Don't you worry about a thing." I hung up and shoved the phone back in my pocket. The machinery was in motion. I got up from the rocker and walked to the tool shed. I slid the largest brass key into the padlock. The mechanism, perfectly oiled from my habit of keeping things in order, gave way without resistance. I pulled open the heavy metal door. Inside, it smelled of fine dust and dry wood. There was plenty of room to store an 8-foot table, room for 8 upholstered chairs, room for several flat screens, room to teach them what emptiness feels like. I left the shed door cracked, ready to receive my repossessed merchandise, and went back inside the house. The vibe in the living room was exactly the same. Hunter was still on the couch, laughing at something on his screen. Right then, I heard Melissa's hurried footsteps coming down the stairs. She was fully made up, purse on her shoulder, drenched in a sweet perfume that choked the air. She breezed through the kitchen, grabbed her car keys, and saw me standing in the hallway. "Mom, I'm heading to the store," she said without making eye contact, checking something on her phone. "The kids eat at 2. I left cash on the counter for them to order pizzas since I didn't have time to prep anything. "Oh, and do me a favor and tidy up the dining room, please. Some of my girlfriends are coming over for coffee this afternoon." She didn't even give me time to nod. She walked out the front door, leaving it half-latched like always. I walked over to the kitchen counter. Sure enough, there was a crumpled $20 bill under the salt shaker, pizza money. I looked at the filthy dining room, the egg-crusted plates, the scattered chairs. My chair was still missing, exiled to some corner so it wouldn't bother anyone. I walked over to the oak table, ran my hand along the hand-carved edge, feeling the hardness of the wood. Then, I walked to the sink. I pulled out a heavy-duty black trash bag, the kind you use for yard work. I wasn't going to wash a single plate. I wasn't going to wipe a single stain. I grabbed the dirty dishes off the table, one by one, and without bothering to scrape the leftovers, I tossed them into the black bag, the ceramic mugs I bought in New York, the silverware coated in food, the filthy napkins, everything into the bag. I tied a tight blind knot in the black plastic and dragged the bag to the corner of the kitchen, leaving it right next to the trash can, but entirely outside of it, in plain sight. The dining room was cleared. Clean of garbage, but completely naked. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the space they had stolen from me. The silence of the house was only broken by the electronic blips of Hunter's phone in the living room. Soon, very soon, that noise would disappear too. I tucked the yellow folder under my arm, feeling the comforting weight of the papers. Every receipt was a nail in the coffin of their entitlement. They had made the mistake of taking the shade of the tree for granted, thinking they could chop off its branches without suffering the consequences of the burning sun. I walked back to the stairs, slowly, favoring my left knee, but with my head held high and my chest full of the unbreakable resolve of a merchant who had just opened her shop to collect all outstanding debts. It was exactly 12:40 p.m. when the ecosystem of my house collapsed. I was sitting in the rocking chair in my bedroom, mentally reviewing the inventory of my strategy, when a guttural howl ripped through the heavy quiet of the hallway. It wasn't a scream of physical pain. It was pure, absolute modern despair. "It kicked me out! There's no Wi-Fi!" Hunter's voice echoed from the living room, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps taking the stairs 2 at a time. Almost instantly, the twins' bedroom doors flew open. The digital oxygen had vanished, and my grandkids were crawling out of their caves like animals disoriented by smoke. I heard the frantic knocking on my door. I didn't get up right away. I let the anxiety marinate a little, remembering all the times I knocked on their doors to tell them dinner was ready, only to be completely ignored. I turned the doorknob slowly. Hunter stood there, phone gripped tight, his eyes wide and practically bloodshot from screen glare. "Grandma, the router has a red light. You need to call the company to fix it. I was in the middle of a tournament. I looked him up and down." He was wearing the same wrinkled t-shirt from yesterday. My face stayed as blank as a poker player down at the riverboat casino. "There's nothing to fix, kiddo," I answered, my tone soft, almost soothing. "The company cut the service. I imagine it's a permanent cancellation." "What do you mean permanent?" "You always pay it on the 2nd of the month," one of the twins chimed in, poking his head over his older brother's shoulder. They knew my exact billing cycle, but they didn't know my birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Times change, kids. The pension doesn't stretch like it used to, and we have to cut unnecessary expenses. Since there's no room for me in the dining room anymore, I figured there was no room in my budget for broadband luxuries either. You'll have to use your cellular data, if you have any." I shut the door in their faces before they could formulate a response. I stood behind the wood, listening to the chaos. The mutters of outrage turned into angry text messages to their mother, which, of course, wouldn't send because they had no signal. It was my first checkmate of the day, and the sound of cybernetic silence tasted like pure glory. By 2:30 p.m., hunger started to eclipse the tragedy of the internet. From my bedroom window, I saw the 2 little girls playing in the backyard with some old dolls, bored out of their minds without their tablets. Hunter went down to the kitchen, and after a while of opening and slamming drawers and the fridge door, he yelled my name from the bottom of the stairs. I took the steps slowly, resting my hand on the railing. Hunter was standing in front of the kitchen counter, holding the crumpled $20 bill Melissa had left under the salt shaker. "Grandma," my mom said to order pizzas. "Call the pizza place downtown, the usual one." I crossed my arms, feeling the weight of my brass keys in my skirt pocket. "My phone is prepaid, Hunter, and I haven't added minutes. Besides, I'm nobody's secretary. Your mother left the money for you. Figure it out. But I don't have internet to look up the number, and I don't have service to call." He exploded, throwing his arms up in dramatic exasperation. "What are we supposed to do? The girls are hungry." "That's the great mystery of adulthood, son," I replied, flashing a half smile. "Back in my day, when hunger struck, you grabbed a couple of eggs, chopped up a tomato and an onion, and made yourself a damn good meal. The fridge is full. The stove works. That 20 will get you plenty if you walk down to the corner bakery. It's up to you." I turned my back on him and walked to the pantry. I pulled out a small can of tuna I kept hidden behind the jelly jars, a ripe tomato, and a sleeve of saltine crackers. I prepped my lunch in silence under the stunned gaze of my grandson, who looked like he was watching some incomprehensible magic trick. I took my plate and went to sit on the patio in the shade of the mango tree. They ended up eating dry cereal with milk straight from the carton, because not one of those 3 teenagers had the initiative to ignite a burner on the stove. The seed of discomfort was planted, and it was sprouting fast. At exactly 5 p.m., the sound of Melissa's car engine announced the next phase of my plan. She wasn't alone. I heard the high-pitched laughter of 2 of her friends, the clinking of bracelets, and the clatter of heels on the pavement. Melissa was coming to show off her perfect life, her spacious house, and her afternoon coffee, magically served by the resident ghost. I stayed in my rocker on the patio, where I had a perfect view of the kitchen through the glass sliding door. Melissa walked in, playing the grand hostess. "Come on in, girls. Make yourselves comfortable in the living room. I'll make us some coffee and get those cookies I bought." Her voice cut off abruptly. I watched her body go completely rigid as she entered the kitchen. Her friends stopped in the doorway, trading confused looks. Melissa walked over to the dining room table, which looked massive and empty without the placemats, the silverware, the centerpieces. Then, her eyes darted to the corner by the trash can. There sat the giant black plastic bag, bulging and giving off the faint smell of rotting food. Melissa pinched the bag open with 2 fingers, leaning in. All the color drained from her face, and then she flushed a furious, violent red. The egg-smeared plates, the fine ceramic mugs, and the filthy silverware were piled up in there like rubble in a vacant lot. She stormed out to the patio, leaving her friends alone in the kitchen. She stopped dead in front of my rocking chair, shaking with rage, but keeping her voice to a venomous hiss so the guests wouldn't hear her scream. "Mom, what is the meaning of this? Why are the dirty dishes thrown in a garbage bag like we're a bunch of pigs? I asked you to tidy up the dining room." I didn't stop rocking. The sway of the wicker chair was rhythmic. "Peaceful. Ah, that," I said, adjusting my glasses on the bridge of my nose. "Since you informed me this morning that there's no room for my chair in the dining room, I did some math. If there's no room for me at the table, I suppose my old hands don't fit in the sink either. I wash what I dirty, Melissa. The rest is merchandise that doesn't belong to me." "I have company, Mom. You're humiliating me in front of my friends," she hissed fiercely, balling her fists. "Humiliation is a dish best served cold, sweetheart," I replied, looking her dead in the eye with the exact same coldness she used when she sent me to eat in my room hours earlier. "Oh, and by the way, there's no internet. You're going to have to talk to your friends the old-fashioned way." Melissa gasped for air like I'd punched her in the gut. She spun around and went back into the kitchen. She had to put on rubber gloves right in front of her friends, pull the dishes out of the garbage bag one by one, scrape off the dried food, and wash them in a frantic rush, dying of embarrassment while she mumbled some clumsy excuse about an ant infestation. Her friends, deeply uncomfortable, drank a glass of water and bolted before 6 o'clock. The night passed in a Cold War standstill. Melissa screamed at me once the kids went to sleep, accusing me of going senile, of being vindictive, of trying to drive her crazy. I just sat on the edge of my bed, with the yellow folder on my lap, stroking the edge of the cardboard, and listened. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "Get some sleep, Melissa. Tomorrow is going to be a heavy day." And it was. Wednesday broke with an overcast sky, typical coastal weather before a storm. Melissa rushed out the door to work at 9 a.m., slamming the front door to make her annoyance crystal clear. The kids were still sleeping, exhausted by the lack of digital stimulation. At exactly 10 a.m., the roar of a diesel engine rattled the living room windows. I peeked through the blinds. It was Frank's truck, a beast of burden, with thick wooden side rails and peeling paint. He parked right out front. I opened the door before he even rang the bell. Frank stood there, a mountain of a man in a tank top that showed off arms like tree trunks, flanked by 2 young guys chewing gum and wearing canvas-back braces. "Boss lady, at your service," Frank said, taking off a faded baseball cap out of respect. "You just point to where we start moving the freight. Come on in, boys. Try not to make too much of a racket at first. The upstairs cargo is still asleep," I instructed, stepping aside to let the 3 giants in. I led them to the stairs. My steps were solid. The adrenaline of execution had wiped out any pain in my left knee. "First stop, the kids' rooms," I whispered when we reached the upstairs hallway. "I want all the flat-screen TVs. There are 4 in total. Unplug them, wrap them in those moving blankets, and take them straight down to the truck. Those are going to your storage unit, Frank. Frank nodded without a single question. Dock hands don't question the foreman. They opened the twins' door with the stealth of professional cat burglars. The boys were snoring, tangled in their sheets. The movers approached the wall, unplugged the cables with surgical precision, and unhooked the massive 50-inch screen from its metal mount. The faint clank of metal woke one of them up. The kid bolted upright in bed, rubbing his eyes, completely disoriented at the sight of two enormous strangers in his room walking off with his most prized possession. "What? What are you doing? Grandma!" "We're being robbed!" the twins screamed, kicking off the blankets. I appeared in the doorway, my hands folded over my stomach. "Nobody's robbing anything, kid. It's a simple asset audit," I said, my voice clear and authoritative. "Keep at it, boys." We moved to the girls' room. They were awake, but struck mute with terror seeing the movers walk in. They huddled in the corner of the bed as their TV vanished out the door. The real confrontation happened in Hunter's room. He was already awake, frustrated by his dead desktop computer. When he saw Frank walk straight toward his curved monitor, he leaped out of his chair. Hey, what the hell is your problem? Leave my stuff alone." Hunter tried to shove one of the helpers, but Frank took a step forward, planting his barrel chest like a retaining wall. Hunter bounced off him and froze at the dock worker's hard stare. "With all due respect, kid, we're acting on orders from the owner of the house." Frank grunted, his raspy voice leaving zero room for debate. "Grandma, tell them to drop my TV. My mom is going to kill you." Hunter screamed, his face red with rage and impotence as he leaned out into the hall. "Your mother doesn't own that screen, Hunter. I paid for it in 12 monthly installments, and I have the receipts in my bedroom. So technically, I am repossessing my own property. And tell them to grab that gaming chair too, Frank. That thing cost me a pretty penny and it's an eyesore." Hunter's jaw dropped. He was entirely incapable of processing this absolute strip mining. His entertainment sanctuary was being dismantled in front of his eyes with military efficiency. Once all 4 screens and the chair were secured in the truck, I went downstairs. My 5 grandkids were clustered on the stairs like a little tribe of castaways, watching the operation in their pajamas, shivering between fury and disbelief. "Now for the masterpiece, Frank," I said, pointing to the beating heart of the house. The dining room. Frank and his boys surrounded the massive red oak table. It was heavy, solid wood, built to last for generations. They had to clear the centerpieces and squat low to lift it from the base. The veins in Frank's neck popped as the wood lifted off the terracotta floor. "This one goes to the tool shed in the backyard," I instructed, walking ahead to clear the path. The sound of the men's shuffling feet carrying the table echoed through the entire house. It was the sound of an empire falling. They carried it out the sliding glass door to the patio. Then they came back for the chairs. 1, 2, 3, 4. All 8 upholstered chairs disappeared out the door, swallowed by the metal mouth of the tool shed. I walked over to the brass padlock, slid the thick shackle into place, and snapped it shut with a definitive metallic click. I pocketed the key. Frank wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. "Job's done, Miss Sylvia. Everything locked up and secured. The screens are in the back of the truck." I pulled a wad of bills from my apron and handed it to him. Frank took it, nodded with profound respect, and headed for the exit with his crew. The diesel engine roared back to life, slowly rolling away down the main street. I turned around and walked back inside. The space where the red oak table once reigned was now a desert of terracotta tiles. The light streaming through the window illuminated the dust motes floating in the air, right where they used to sit and ignore me. The house felt immense, naked, echoing. I walked to the dead center of the void. My footsteps produced a lonely, hollow echo. I looked at the stairs. Hunter, the twins, and the girls were still petrified. It was a perfect portrait. 5 dethroned heirs staring at the ruins of their comfort. "So, where are we going to eat now?" one of the twins asked, her voice barely a whisper, tears pooling in the corners of her eyes. I smoothed the pleats of my skirt with extreme slowness, lifted my chin, and looked at them with the relentless calm of a captain who has retaken full control of her ship. The emptiness in that room wasn't a loss. It was the first installment of a debt that was just starting to be collected. I looked my granddaughter dead in the eye. Her pale, round face reflected genuine panic, the terror of a generation that has never had to improvise to survive. The void of the dining room echoed around us, amplifying the weight of her question. "On the floor, sweetheart," I answered. My voice was soft, but firm, entirely stripped of mockery. "Or, if you prefer, you can take your plates to your bedrooms and eat in bed. After all, that was your mother's brilliant idea yesterday morning." All 5 of them went dead silent. Hunter clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tight. He wanted to say something. He wanted to raise his voice and assert his supposed authority as the older brother. But when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. He realized, maybe for the first time in his 19 years, that authority isn't something you scream. Authority is backed by resources, by sweat, and by ownership, and he had exactly 0 of the 3. I turned my back on them with the tranquility of someone taking a Sunday stroll in the park, and walked into the kitchen. I made a pitcher of lemonade, pulled out a glass, and poured myself a drink. The echo of my own movements in the furnitureless house was fascinating to me. It felt like clearing the weeds from an abandoned lot to finally see the true foundation of the building again. I took my glass and walked out to the patio, sitting in my wicker rocker under the mango tree. The afternoon stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. No internet, no TVs to hypnotize them, and no dining room to congregate and demand food. My grandkids looked like ghosts wandering through a maze. From my spot on the patio, I watched them through the glass. Hunter paced back and forth in the living room, staring at the blank wall where his entertainment center used to hang. The twins sat on the terracotta floor, leaning against the kitchen wall, hugging their knees in a graveyard silence. Hunger, that relentless debt collector that doesn't care about tantrums or pride, showed up just past 3 p.m. One of the twins, driven by basic instinct, got up off the floor and opened the fridge. She pulled out a pack of ham, a block of cheese, and a jar of mayo. She put them on the counter. Then she grabbed a loaf of sliced bread. She made a sandwich with clumsy movements, leaving the lids off the jars and the ham half-wrapped. When she took her first bite standing up, staring at the massive crater where the red oak table used to be, the tears started rolling down her cheeks. It wasn't the crying of deep sorrow, it was the sheer frustration of discomfort. Her siblings slowly followed suit. They made themselves cold food and sat on the floor in the hallway, eating in silence, struggling to swallow the reality of their new existence. I didn't feel sorry for them. Down at the port market, I learned that sometimes you have to let the apprentice smash their finger in the scale so they learn to treat it with respect. They were experiencing their very first lesson in adulthood. Nothing is free, and nobody owes you a damn thing. The kitchen wall clock hit 6:15 p.m. when I heard Melissa's car engine cut off out front. The sound of her keys in the front door was like the bell ringing for the final round of a boxing match. I took a deep breath, settled the yellow folder on my lap, and braced myself. The coastal breeze blew warm, rustling the leaves of the mango tree. Melissa threw the door open, talking on her cell phone, complaining about downtown traffic. "Yeah, girl, I'm telling you, the lights were unbearable." "Hold on a sec, I'm walking in the house." The clatter of her heels on the tile stopped dead. The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a machete. I saw her silhouette through the glass window. She dropped her purse on the floor. The cell phone slipped from her hand and hit the terracotta with a sharp crack. Her eyes swept the vast emptiness of the room. No table, no chairs, no centerpieces. Just empty space and the echo of her own accelerated breathing. Hunter, girls, she screamed, her voice shredded with panic. We've been robbed! Call the cops! They cleared out the house! The kids dragged themselves out of their rooms and down the stairs. They didn't look like victims of a home invasion. They looked like prisoners of war. We didn't get robbed, Mom, Hunter said, leaning against the banister with total apathy. It was Grandma. She brought some movers this morning. They took the dining set, the bedroom TVs, even my gaming chair, and there's no internet either. She cut it. Melissa blinked rapidly, processing the data. Her face went from ghost-white panic to the deep crimson of unhinged fury. She spun on her heels, locked her eyes on the sliding glass door to the patio, and found me there, sitting in my rocker, swaying with maddening slowness. She stormed out to the patio like a hurricane. Her steps were heavy, aggressive. She stopped 3 feet away from me, fists clenched, the veins in her neck bulging. You're crazy. You've gone completely insane, Mom, she roared, spitting the words. How dare you take the furniture out of my house? What kind of sick punishment is this? You bring my stuff back right now, or I swear to God I'll put you in a home for senile dementia. I stopped the rocker, planting my shoes firmly on the concrete patio. I took a second to look at her bloodshot eyes, her defiant posture, her totally intact arrogance. Lower your voice, Melissa. The neighbors don't need to know about your shortcomings, I said. It was the coldest, most controlled voice I could muster. And before you keep spitting threats you can't back up, I suggest you watch your mouth. Because you're about to find out that you don't have the power, the money, or the authority to send me anywhere. It's my house. That's my stuff. Those are my kids' TVs. She screamed, though her voice wavered slightly when she noticed my absolute lack of fear. I stood up from the rocker, slowly. At 71, I was still a handspan taller than her, and years of hauling sacks had given me a broad, imposing build. I picked up the yellow folder from my lap and unwound the string, keeping it closed. That is your problem, Melissa. Your logic is rotten to the core, I said, opening the folder and pulling out the documents with precision. You've lived so long in the illusion of your own comfort that you bought into the fairy tale that you were the owner of the ship just because I let you play captain. I pulled out the first document. The paper crinkled with a dry snap. Read this, I ordered, holding the property deed right in front of her face. Melissa stepped back, confused. Her eyes dropped to the official paper covered in notary seals and signatures. It's the deed to the house, she whispered, frowning. Exactly. And if you know how to read, you'll see that the only name listed under owner is Sylvia. This house, from the foundation to the roof where the rain leaks in, which I pay to have fixed, is mine, not yours. Mine. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome. Melissa swallowed hard. The red in her face began to fade, replaced by an ashen gray. She tried to reclaim lost ground by lifting her chin. I'm your daughter. This is my inheritance. It's the same thing. I let out a short, joyless laugh. A harsh sound that made her flinch. Inheritances are handed over when the dead stop breathing, my girl. And as you can see, I am breathing just fine. So as long as my heart is beating, this isn't an inheritance. It's my capital. I pulled the manila envelope from the left flap of the folder and extracted the 7 original carbon copy receipts. I held them up like a winning hand in a poker game. Yesterday morning, you took my chair. You said there was no room for me in the dining room. Your logic was brilliant. Shove the old lady in her bedroom so she doesn't ruin the scenery of your breakfast. But you made an unforgivable miscalculation for any merchant. You forgot to check who owned the merchandise. I unfolded the first receipt and held it at her eye level. Red oak dining table, 8 feet long, 8 upholstered chairs, billed to Sylvia, paid in cash. That dining room is mine. I unfolded the next one. 4 high-definition flat-screen TVs, paid in 12 monthly installments on Sylvia's credit card. They are mine. I kept flipping through the papers one by one, tapping them lightly with the back of my hand so the sound punctuated my words. The fridge, the stove, the mattresses your children sleep on, the internet service I just permanently canceled. Everything is in my name. Everything comes out of my pocket. You work part-time at a clothing boutique and barely make enough for your lotions and your lattes. Melissa backed up step by step, forced into retreat by the crushing weight of the evidence. The patio had fallen dead silent. My 5 grandkids were clustered at the glass door, listening to every word, watching their mother's armor of authority dissolve like a sugar cube in boiling water. I opened the doors of my house to you 10 years ago when you showed up crying with your suitcases and not a dime to your name, I continued, lowering the papers but keeping my eyes locked on hers. I gave you a roof, food, security. I gave you the space to raise your kids without the panic of not knowing what they were going to eat for dinner. And in exchange, what did I get? I was erased. You turned me into the ghost who pays the bills, the maid who washes the dirty plates you leave on my own table. Mom, I didn't mean to, Melissa stammered. The arrogance was gone. Her shoulders slumped, and her hands started to shake. Do not interrupt me. I snapped, my tone so sharp it made her shrink. Yesterday you taught me your logic. Today, I am teaching you mine. If in my own house, at the table I bought, there is no room for me to sit and have a cup of coffee, then there is no table for anyone. The rules of the game have changed, Melissa. I reached into my skirt pocket and pulled out my brass keys. I shook them in front of her. The metallic clinking sounded like a funeral bell. Here are the keys to the padlock on the tool shed, where the dining set is currently resting. Frank took the TVs to his storage unit. My assets are secured. And now, I am going to give you the new terms of your lease on my property. Melissa stared at me, eyes wide, brimming with unshed tears. The panic of absolute vulnerability had paralyzed her. The grandkids behind the glass looked like pillars of salt. Condition number 1, I said, holding up a finger. Starting next month, you are going to pay rent to live here. You will do the math, and you will give me 20% of your paycheck. It's not much, but it's a start, so you understand what a roof costs. I held up a second finger. Condition number 2, the electric, water, and gas bills will be split down the middle. If you can't afford it, I suggest you turn off the lights when you leave a room and take cold showers. The internet is a luxury. If Hunter and the rest of them want it, they'll have to go out and find weekend jobs to pay for it themselves. I do not fund freeloaders. I held up a third finger. Condition number 3. I am never washing another plate, sweeping another hallway, or cooking for the whole platoon ever again, unless I do it out of the goodness of my heart. The household chores will be divided equally among your 5 children. They have healthy hands and feet. If I wake up to a dirty kitchen, the food in the fridge goes in the trash. Melissa openly sobbed. She buried her face in her hands, utterly defeated. The house of cards where she reigned had collapsed under the weight of a few old receipts and a dose of harsh reality. And finally, I said, stepping forward until I was inches away from her, respect for me in this house is absolute. I am the matriarch of this family. I am the provider of this infrastructure, and I am the owner of these walls. If I ever hear you disrespect me again, if I ever see you ignore me again, or if anyone ever sends me to eat in my room again, I will use these brass keys to lock the front door from the outside. I will sell the house in under a month. I will move into a beachfront hotel and live out my final years like a queen, and you all will have to find shelter on the streets. The silence fell over the patio again, broken only by my daughter's muffled crying. I looked toward the glass door. Hunter had his head down, staring at his sneakers. The twins were crying quietly, holding on to each other. The little ones looked scared, but attentive. They had just witnessed the most brutal, cleanest transfer of power of their short lives. They had watched the false queen fall, and for the very first time, they recognized the true owner of the territory. I didn't hug Melissa. I didn't offer her words of comfort. The blind affection that forgives everything was the poison that got us into this mess in the first place. Down at the docks, when a debtor finally admits bankruptcy, you don't give them a hug, you give them a payment plan and put them to work. I turned around, tucked the receipts back into the yellow folder, and slid it under my arm. I walked toward the sliding glass door. My grandkids scrambled out of the way instantly, parting the sea with clumsy haste, lowering their eyes in a gesture of absolute submission. A respect born of terror, but one I hoped time would forge into genuine gratitude. I walked into the house, down the terracotta hallway. The void of the dining room didn't feel desolate anymore. On the contrary, it felt like a blank canvas. The rules had been laid down, and the debts were on the table. The market of dignity was open for business again, and I had just set the new prices. The first month after what is now whispered about in this house as the day of the repo was a true test of endurance. The silence that lived in these walls was no longer the silence of contempt, it was the silence of caution. The whole house seemed to hold its breath when I walked down the halls. My footsteps on the terracotta set the rhythm for a new era, one where invisibility had been permanently banished at the point of receipts and brass keys. For the first 2 weeks, chaos reigned in the kitchen. I would sit in my rocker under the mango tree with my glass of lemonade, watching through the glass as the crystal bubble of my daughter and grandkids finally shattered into a million pieces. I watched Melissa burn 3 batches of rice before she figured out that you can't just leave the stove on high. I watched the twins cry at the sink because the dish soap dried out their hands. I watched Hunter fight with the broom, pushing dirt from one side of the room to the other without ever getting it in the dustpan, cursing under his breath. I didn't step in once. My maternal, grandmotherly instincts clawed at my insides, begging me to get up, take the rag out of their hands, and fix their lives like I always had. But I remembered my missing chair. I remembered the plastic tray with the scraps of my own breakfast. I swallowed my pity and bit my lip. Down at the port market, if you forgive a client's debt out of pity, the next day you have 10 more demanding the same treatment. The love that demands no effort only breeds parasites, and I refused to leave behind a legacy of useless people. The first sign that the soil was bearing fruit came on the first day of the following month. I was in my bedroom, checking my accounts in a spiral notebook, when I heard 2 timid knocks on my door. It was a new sound. Before, they would just barge in or yell for me from the hallway. "Come in," I said, closing the notebook. Melissa walked in slowly. She was wearing her uniform from the clothing boutique, but her eyes had a different shine to them, a mix of genuine exhaustion and resignation. She stood in front of me, clutching a white paper envelope in her hands. She didn't try to sit on my bed or invade my space. "Mom," she started, her voice a little raspy. "I got paid today. I did the math like you asked. Here is 20% of my check and half of the electric bill that came on Tuesday." She reached out and placed the envelope on my nightstand. I looked at her in silence for a few seconds. Her nails didn't have that expensive polish she used to wear. They were clipped short and clean. She had stopped ordering takeout and started taking Tupperware with her own home-cooked meals to work. "Sit down, Melissa," I told her, pointing to the small armchair by the window. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. "It wasn't easy, was it?" I asked, resting my arms on my knees. "I had to cancel the department store credit card," she admitted, looking at the floor. "And the girls complained all week because I cut out the brand-name cookies and bought sweetbread from the corner bakery. They kind of hate me right now." I let out a soft laugh, the first kind sound I had directed at her in 30 days. "They don't hate you. Honey, they're testing you. They're looking for a weak spot in the fence to see where they can graze without putting in the effort. If you cave now, next month you'll be drowning in debt again. You don't buy respect by giving them everything they ask for. You earn it by showing them the boat isn't sinking because you're at the helm." Melissa looked up. There were unshed tears in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mom, for the envelope. And for not throwing us out on the street that day. The street is for people beyond saving, Melissa. You were just resting on your laurels. Now go get some rest. Tomorrow is your day to scrub the bathrooms." She walked out of my room with her back a little straighter. I took the white envelope, counted the bills, and locked them in my safe. I didn't need that money to live, but she needed to hand it over to learn how to survive. Hunter's case was rougher. By the middle of the third week, internet withdrawal had him climbing the walls. One afternoon, he cornered me in the hallway, blocking my path with his 6-foot frame. "Grandma, I'll pressure wash the patio, I'll clean the windows, whatever you want. But please, buy a month of internet. I'm going crazy." I looked him up and down. He was wearing a clean t-shirt, a massive achievement considering his previous habits, but his attitude was still that of a demanding beggar. "I sweep my own patio, Hunter, and I like to clean my windows my own way," I answered, nudging him aside with a gentle push of my arm. "If you want money, go find someone who needs your hands. Down at the docks, they're always short on backs to haul sacks. Ask for Frank. Tell him I sent you." I thought he'd be insulted, that he'd turn around, lock himself in his room, and curse my name. But boredom is a strict teacher. The next day, at 5 a.m., I heard the front door open and close. He came back at 3 p.m. He smelled like raw fish, stale sweat, and diesel fuel. His hands were red and blistered, and his shirt was glued to his body. He walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and chugged half a liter of water straight from the pitcher without me saying a single word. Then he looked at me, exhausted, but with a spark of wild pride in his eyes. "Frank says he expects me back at 4:30 a.m. tomorrow to unload the onion trucks." He panted slightly. "Onions stain your hands and make you cry, boy. Scrub them good with lye soap before you go to sleep." That was all I said to him. By the end of that month, Hunter bought a portable Wi-Fi hotspot with his own money, set it up in the living room, and charged his siblings a weekly fee for the password. He had become a merchant. He understood the value of the merchandise. I just smiled from my rocking chair, watching him protect his investment tooth and nail, denying the twins access on the day they refused to wash their dishes. The total transformation of the house wasn't magical, it was mechanical, like a clock that gets wound up after years of gathering dust. The gears ground clumsily at first, but then they found their rhythm. The little girls learned to pick up their toys without being told, terrified that Grandma would call the men in the trucks to haul them away. The twins discovered that ironing their own school uniforms saved them from their mother's scolding. The void in the dining room was still there, immense and silent. For 45 days, the family ate at the kitchen counter in shifts, or sitting on the living room couch. The crater in the terracotta floor was a constant reminder of the rules of the game. Until the second Sunday of the second month, I woke up at 6 a.m. The air was crisp, and the coastal sky had that violet tint that promises a clear day. I walked to the kitchen to make my dark roast coffee. The house was spotless. The sink shined, free of dirty dishes. Hunter had taken the trash out to the curb the night before. The smell of bleach, pine cleaner, and hard work hung in the air. They had paid their debt with interest. They had learned to look past their own belly buttons. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number I knew by heart. "Frank, morning, my boy. Morning, boss lady. You name it. What are we hauling today?" "I need you to come with your truck at 10 sharp. We're pulling the dining set out of the shed and putting it back where it belongs. The flat screens stay in your storage unit until December. If the kids are still working hard by then, maybe I'll sell them back to them." "Whatever you say, Miss Sylvia. 10 o'clock, I'm there." Around noon, the heavy thud of Frank and his crew's boots echoed through the house. Melissa and the kids, who were in the living room, jumped to their feet, terrified, thinking a second wave of repossessions was underway. They clustered in the hallway, eyes wide, watching the men carry the massive red oak table from the backyard and place it dead center in the room. Then they brought in the upholstered chairs, one by one. The sound of the wood settling onto the terracotta tile was like a heart beating back to life. "All done, boss. Everything's in its place," Frank said, wiping his hands on his denim jeans. "Looks good as new." I paid him his day rate, gave him a generous tip, and walked him to the door. When I shut it and turned back to the interior of the house, I found my family surrounding the table, not daring to touch it. They looked like tourists admiring an untouchable monument. I walked toward them with a slow, steady pace. My brass keys jingled in my pocket, a sound that now inspired deep, absolute respect. I reached the head of the table, the one by the window, the one that caught the ocean breeze. I rested my hand on the back of the chair. "The table is back, because I have decided to invite you to take a seat under my roof," I said, looking every single one of them in the eye, from the tallest down to the smallest. "Space in this house is not demanded, it is earned. And you have proven that you know how to earn it." Melissa covered her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. Hunter nodded, showing a seriousness I hadn't seen in him before he started hauling sacks at the docks. "Melissa, go to the kitchen and make that beef stew you learned how to cook last week," I ordered, my voice soft. "Hunter, set the plates and silverware. Girls, bring the napkins and the glasses. Today, we eat like a family." The explosion of movement was instantaneous. It was a perfect choreography of gratitude. Nobody complained. Nobody dragged their feet. In less than half an hour, the smell of cilantro, onions, and seared meat flooded the house, scrubbing any lingering bitterness from the air. When the center of the table was filled with the steaming clay pot, the hot tortillas, and pitchers of ice water, I stepped up to my spot. I didn't have to pull my chair out. Hunter stepped out, grabbed the back of the red oak chair, and pulled it back for me. "Have a seat, Grandma," he said, keeping his eyes down in a show of respect, but speaking with the firm voice of a young man who understands his place in the world. I sat down. The wood molded to my back with the familiarity of an old embrace. Hunter slid the chair in smoothly until I was the perfect distance from the table. Then, everyone took their seats. Melissa picked up the ladle and served the first bowl of stew, making sure to scoop the tenderest cuts of meat and the best-cooked vegetables. She didn't hand it to her kids. She walked over to my spot and placed it in front of me. Then she grabbed the ceramic mug, filled it with steaming dark roast coffee, and set it by my right hand. "Enjoy your meal, Mom," she said, her voice full of genuine reverence. "Enjoy your meal, family," I replied. Only then did the rest of them start serving themselves. The clinking of spoons against ceramic filled the room. The coastal breeze blew in through the window, brushing my face, carrying the scent of salt and the open sea. We ate in peace. They talked about their days, their little victories, and their deep exhaustion. I listened, only chiming in when they asked for advice. I was no longer the invisible old woman cluttering up the scenery of their modern lives. I was the matriarch, the owner of the capital and the wisdom, the woman who built this sanctuary with her bare hands and who had been willing to burn it to the ground to save them from their own arrogance. Society loves to tell women with white hair that our time has passed. They demand that we step aside, shrink ourselves until we fit in a dark corner, and hand over the keys to our kingdom in exchange for crumbs of conditional affection. They want us sweet, docile, and quiet. They want us sitting in the back bedroom, eating off a plastic tray. But I am Sylvia. I was a grain merchant. I fought with dock workers, and I built my wealth dollar by dollar in the hellish heat of the wholesale market. My skin might be wrinkled, and my left knee might betray me on cold mornings, but my will is forged in cast iron. That afternoon, when we finished eating, I didn't lift a single finger to clear the plates. Hunter and the twins took care of clearing the table and washing the dishes. Melissa swept the dining room. I stood up. I walked slowly to the stairs and went up to my bedroom. I opened the bottom drawer of my mahogany wardrobe. I slipped the small key in, removed the false bottom, and looked at the yellow folder resting inside. The deeds and the receipts were right where they belonged, intact. waiting like a silent army in case they were ever needed again. I touched the worn cardboard with my fingertips. I didn't need to pull it out. True power isn't what you scream from the rooftops every day. It's what people know you possess and are willing to respect without you having to prove it. I closed the false compartment. I turned the key and slipped it into my skirt pocket, right next to the heavy brass ring. I walked over to my bedroom window and looked out at the sunlit backyard. The mango tree was still there, its deep roots gripping the soil that I bought, casting its shade over a family that had, finally, learned to honor its oldest branch.